I was watching this video earlier. I think it was Midas channel. I forget exactly what the name is there. And I mean, of course, they post some oppositional Trump stuff, so there's context there. And so, in terms of their report, that they were suggesting that some portions of NATO are. So there's a little bit of tension possibly with NATO and the U.S. Trump approach among NATO, because some have looked into questions of Trump associating with Russia and maybe betraying some of the NATO efforts to work with Ukraine. And so what's kind of interesting in this whole conundrum is Trump, if he's still trying to negotiate with Russia to alleviate having this like full divide of sides, you know how they have like Russia, China, Iran and whatnot. It is kind of peculiar with all of these like logistics taking place, because the suggestion that portions of like this entanglement, right? Portions of NATO trying to speak on behalf of Ukraine, but some of those portions of NATO being the ones that were open to resisting the Trump U.S.-Israel connection and open to negotiating for Palestinian negotiations, also supporting Ukraine, then feel blocked by this, like possibly this issue with Russia. But then Trump negotiating with Russia because he seems to feel that he's being isolated from Israel's negotiations on the stage with other countries, and possibly trying to strategize out of that dynamic of just having the vulnerabilities of the U.S.-Israel alliance. And so what's interesting about it is that now it's like this tension with Israel on the geopolitical world stage seems to be pressuring like Trump to pressure his alliances with NATO and other connections, basically isolating the U.S. Whereas if those entities, so say like NATO, the isolation coming from just this compliance to Israel, just the Israel pulling the power strings and trying to force his hand now with Iran, at a time when the other world nations are kind of being pushed out and into like suspicious of these conundrums. It's interesting that that conundrum wouldn't necessarily be there between NATO and the U.S. and negotiations de-escalating Russia and Ukraine, even though they're all pinned against each other, if they were all free from these forced negotiations with Israel. So I was talking about this earlier, and it's not even just all of Israel. I think even portions within Israel feel trapped in this as well, and they're coming out and saying, we don't support this improper Christian Israel Zionist approach on the world stage that is forcing world nations to geopolitically line up with the improper Zionist unto Israel approach. But it is that I guess that form of a Zionist Judeo-Christian unto Israel approach. And so in that there was a release from that, then NATO in some of those portions that are trying to advocate for Ukraine and are open to negotiating for Palestinian negotiations wouldn't be so divided against the U.S. if Trump was utilizing mechanisms within these Russia negotiations to actually help diminish pressure on Ukraine and get away from these pressures that Israel's putting on them to geopolitically align with putting pressure against all of these other nations, functionally isolating the U.S. So this is kind of like functionally isolating the U.S. geopolitically, to have the world nations opposed to the U.S. just for the sake of Israel. And if Israel gets Trump to force his hand on the Iran situation, it basically forces the hand of solidifying a sense of preserving this alignment with various entities in the U.S. in relation to battling Iran, and then forcing them to preserve that stance through the market and putting pressure on other nations and continuing pressure on other nations, which would just intensify the world nations being even more enraged and distrusting of the U.S.-Israel alliance, then isolating the Israel-U.S. alliance even more. And so if that happens, I think there'll be an economic error in it and maybe tension on nations, and then causing other nations to produce this breakthrough to separate this like generations of divide between nations that had to do with like Cold War alliances and stuff like that, and the division between some of these negotiations with NATO. So to me, it's just not some like isolated form of like just Iran. It's what it like represents in terms of either a being involved in the shift taking place, or being on the other side of putting pressures for the shift to take place at the cost of like U.S. alliances and whatnot, at a time where internally and externally nations are not aligned in that kind of way. And the nations that have been pinned against each other just no longer seem to have a trust in like the alliance of the U.S. I don't know if this is just going to like have to play out, because that trust is already broken. I mean, all these countries are just saying like broken trust, broken trust, broken trust, broken trust. And then this false form of this type of strength that's adhering just to Israel just seems to be causing like further distrust and further distrust economically, because it's forcing them to try to keep that power by putting more and more economic pressure on all these other nations. And so it's like an economic warfare, which is shifting the idea of like a public world war into like a covert method, or an attempted covert method of world war, but it's like being pushed out into like economic world war. So you're also seeing those that are trying to stay within that control are pushing the hand of the Iran conflict to then say that they will back them through this perpetuation and trajectory of a one-sided economic dominance. But the world is seeing that that economic dominance doesn't include them, because it's a false alliance with Israel at a time where Israel is pushing pressure on other nations to be in a dominant compliance and not really caring whether they have trustworthy economic negotiations or not. So then I guess the question is to think about what would be a strategic way to alleviate that, if there was a different opportunity, or are we just going to like march forward to this the U.S.-Israel connection and that Zionist connection, which the whole world is like mostly starting to separate from. Are they just going to keep doing that, and then they push all of the other nations into like a strong alliance? Or is there a different option at this time? Seeing these tensions, is there a different option to approach shifting gears here?